Great, great. Thank you, thank you. And what a pleasure it is to be with you all this morning. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the very nice introduction, Dr. Horizon. And if it's okay for me to start my presentation, I'll jump right into everything. So I'd like to start by just saying thank you very much to all of you for coming today. I know that your time is valuable, and I really appreciate the chance to spend some of it together. Also, a big thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me to give this presentation. Dr. Kavitha Nair reached out to me for the first time about a year ago to see if I might be able to participate in an earlier event at the SRM Institute of Science and Technology. And I was disappointed that I couldn't participate then. So I was excited to later hear from Dr. Nair again about this conference and the possibility of participating now. I thoroughly enjoyed reading about the conference and the department and the institution, and I took a great virtual tour of the campus and the surrounding area, and it looks wonderful. I really wish that I was there with you in person today with everybody, but it is still a real pleasure to join you virtually, and I hope one day that I can visit in person. But in the meantime, I'm looking forward to talking with you today in this presentation, so let's jump in. And I'm going to share my slides so that you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, so hopefully you can see my slides here up on the screen. And my plan this morning is to speak for about 60 minutes, so we'll have time then for some questions. And let me also point out that I haven't prepared a handout for the presentation because I'll put my PowerPoint slides and an audio recording of this presentation on my website after the conference. The website address is up on the screen here, and I'll put it up again at the end of the presentation. As for the topic of the presentation, you can see from this slide the title that we'll be focusing on transfer of learning or learning transfer in second language teaching. When I saw that the general theme of this year's conference is transdisciplinary learning, I thought that there might be some interesting connections between this theme and the topic of my presentation. The connections depend on how one might define transdisciplinary learning. But it looks like a central feature of many of the definitions that I've seen is the crossing of disciplinary boundaries. And learning transfer is all about boundary crossing too. In fact, one of the connections that we can make here is that transdisciplinary learning actually requires learning transfer. Because for transdisciplinary learning to occur, we have to be able to transfer learning across disciplinary boundaries. We can come back to this later in the presentation as well. So let's take a closer look at this topic, transfer of second language learning. And we'll do so by considering three key questions. What is learning transfer, and why is it important in second language teaching? How have we investigated learning transfer, and what lessons have we learned? And where do we go from here? So let's start with the first question. What is learning transfer, and why is it important in second language teaching? And I think it may help to look at a couple of examples. These are commercials that I found for Barclays Bank to promote their initiative that was called Life Skills. And this was a service to help young people to develop useful skills and to increase their employability. I don't have any connections to this bank, but when I found their commercials online, I thought they were great examples of learning transfer. So let's take a look at the first one, which is called Wind Farm. So I'm going to stop sharing this slide so I can go to the video. share. Just a second. Okay, sorry, a little delay there. And you should be able to see here. Okay, I'm just going to navigate to, oops, I'm sorry. I need to turn on the audio. Share sound. Okay. And you should see the video coming up right now. Right, so again, this is the first of two commercials I'm going to show you. It's about 30 seconds, and this is called Wind Farm. So hopefully the sound came across okay there. What's happening here is that the young woman is participating in some kind of training program that focuses on problem-solving skills. And then we see her applying those skills in a real-life situation when she's working as an engineer dealing with a dangerous storm at a wind farm. Now we'll take a look at one more example. Again, a 30-second commercial that I think is a great example of learning transfer. And this is called Helicopter. Okay, so again, I hope that the audio came through okay. And what's happening in this commercial is that the young man is participating in a similar training program, and here the focus is on listening skills. And then we see him applying those skills in a real-life situation when he's working as an emergency medical technician dealing with a health crisis. So although the word transfer is not used in these commercials, that's exactly what they show. We see young people in a classroom situation developing problem-solving and listening skills, then transferring that learning to situations beyond the classroom, to their work as an engineer and as an emergency medical technician. I'm going to go back to my slides now. So in more general terms, then, learning transfer refers to the application of learning in new situations. And this includes applying problem-solving skills and listening skills from a training course when we are later working as an engineer or as an emergency medical technician. It also includes countless other situations, like when someone who has learned how to drive a car then applies that learning when driving a truck for the first time. Or when someone, or when someone who has learned how to play guitar, then applies that learning when trying to play piano for the first time. Or when someone who has learned a second language at school, then applies that learning when they travel. And the second part of this question is why learning transfer is important in second language teaching. And let me start to answer this question by looking a little more broadly at education in general. Formal education of any type rests on an expectation that learning will transfer. For example, in many countries around the world, children are required to spend years in a school system. To justify this massive investment of a society's resources and of the individual's time, there's obviously an expectation that time spent in the school system will impact students' lives in some way beyond school. For example, when they are at home or in the community, or when they've left school to enter the workforce, and so on. And even as students move within the school system, there's an expectation that learning will have an impact. For example, from one math course to the next, or from a year's worth of classes to an end-of-year examination. Or, in the case of transdisciplinary learning, from one discipline to another. Now, expectations for transfer may be explicit, for example, included in a curriculum's mission statement or a set of goals. Or these expectations may be implicit. But either way, formal education systems do rest on expectations or assumptions that classroom learning can and will transfer within and beyond those systems. And for example, we can see this right here in the Department of English and Foreign Languages at SRM Institute of Science and Technology. The department's website says that the department provides students with the vital training to meet the demands of global communication, and that the department's courses are designed to allow engineering students to meet future professionals' linguistic requirements. To meet these demands and requirements, students will have to transfer learning from their studies to these new situations beyond their studies. So, learning transfer is central to the success of the Department of English and Foreign Languages, as it is with other departments and education and training programs around the world. With that in mind, educators in any subject area should be concerned about transfer. And in second language education, we're no different. Now, if we as second language educators could safely assume that what students learn in our courses would transfer when the need arises, then we would not have to pay so much attention to transfer. And it might seem quite reasonable to assume that learning will lead to transfer, because as humans, our successful ability to transfer learning is actually closely tied to our evolution. We have evolved to be able to recognize patterns in the world around us. For example, to experience a dangerous situation and then to recognize a new, similar dangerous situation, like hearing the sound of one wild animal and then to recognize a similar sound from another animal. This ability to recognize patterns is, in fact, transfer. So as humans, we should be pretty good at this because it's in our DNA. But let's take a closer look at this idea with a little demonstration. I'm going to put a graphic up on the screen, and I'd like you to just look at it and try to figure out what it is. But don't say anything. Okay, now don't say anything, but if you think you know what this is, just raise your hand silently. I can see the audience, so we'll get a rough count of hands. If you think you know what this is, please put your hand up. I don't see too many hands. Okay. Now I'm going to add some information. So now, how many people think that they know what the black and white image on the left side of the screen is? Please put your hands up. I think I see a few more hands. Okay, great. Right, so let's try another one. Okay, again, I'm going to put a picture up. Please look at it and think about what this is. So take a look at that picture. If you think you know what that is, please put your hand up. I see a very small number of hands. Okay, I'm going to add a little bit of information and then the same question. Do you think you know what the image is on the left side of the screen? Here's the extra information. So now, how many people think they know what the image on the left side of the screen is? Please raise your hand. I see a few more hands. Okay. None of this is surprising. So we're going to do one more. I'll show you one more image. And here's a picture of something that's very common. So don't say anything, but if you think you know what this is, this image in the yellow box, please raise your hand. Now, from where I'm sitting, I don't see any hands raised this time. Okay, here's a little bit of help. So now, how many people think that they know what the object inside the yellow box is? Please raise your hands. Okay, now I see a few more. Great. Okay, well, that's it for the pictures, for the demonstration. But what exactly does this show? Well, when I put up the first slide for each of those three objects, many of us did not know what they were. Now, we all have learned in the past what a frog is, or what the pages of a book are, and what a nose is. But we didn't transfer that learning when we were first trying to identify the objects on those slides. Having a little more information for each of the objects helped, because many of us then suddenly made connections. So basically, the circumstances had to be just right for us to transfer our learning about frogs, pages, and noses. So despite the fact that an ability to transfer learning is one of our strengths as a species, it isn't something that we can take for granted. In other words, we can't assume that learning inevitably leads to transfer. The philosopher John Locke drew attention to this problem over 300 years ago. In an essay on human understanding, Locke discussed how we associate ideas with other ideas and described an interesting example. A young gentleman who, having learned to dance, and that to great perfection, there happened to stand an old trunk in the room where he learned. The idea of this remarkable piece of household stuff had so mixed itself with the turns and steps of all his dances that though in that chamber he could dance excellently well, yet it was only whilst that trunk was there, nor could he perform well in any other place, unless that or some such other trunk had its due position in the room. So in other words, John Locke was describing a person who had learned to dance well in a room where the furniture included an old trunk. But if the trunk was removed, or if the person tried to dance in a different room without the trunk, the person could not dance as well. Although John Locke didn't use the word transfer, this is an example of exactly that. A person learning something, but not being able to transfer that learning. Empirical research on learning transfer started about 200 years later, in the early 1900s. And in one of the most famous early studies, researchers had a group of people practice estimating the areas of triangles. Through the training sessions, the participants were able to improve their ability to estimate the areas of rectangles. But when they were then tested on estimating the areas of a larger range of rectangles and estimating the areas of other shapes like circles, triangles, and squares, they didn't do as well as they had done during training. So the researchers concluded that the participants' learning didn't freely transfer. And this is reflected in the centuries worth of research on learning transfer since then. Findings have collectively shown that while learning can transfer, it often doesn't. And this will come as no surprise to many of us because of our experience in classrooms. As teachers, we may have our own examples of situations in which we've seen students have difficulty transferring what they've learned. In one nice example that I read about, a physics professor said that students had successfully learned in class how to calculate how long it would take for a ball to fall to the ground from the top of a tower. But then, when students had a test question asking them to calculate how long it would take a ball to fall to the bottom of a well, students complained that they had not been given any questions about wells in class. So it's clear that learning transfer is important in second language education because it's a basic goal of second language education and because we can't assume that it will occur. So let's move on now to our second question, which asks, how have we investigated learning transfer in second language education and what have we learned? And we'll start with a wide-angle look at learning transfer research because most of the research has been done outside second language education. And it's been interesting and often relevant to second language education. As I mentioned, empirical research on learning transfer began about 120 years ago with that 1901 study that involved people learning how to calculate the area of geometric shapes. That study used an experimental research design, and there have been many other experimental studies like this, sometimes with very interesting approaches. For example, in another one of the early studies, in 1908, a researcher did an experiment with 11 and 12-year-old elementary school students. The focus in this study was the learning of the scientific principle of light deflection when it moves through substances like water. So one of the groups of students was given a theoretical explanation of light deflection, and the other group of students was not. Then both groups were asked to throw darts at a target that was placed under 12 inches of water. The water made it difficult to figure out exactly where the target was because of the light deflection. Now, both groups had similar results throwing darts at the target. And that's interesting because it means the group that received the theoretical explanation was not able to transfer that learning. But then the researcher reduced the depth of the water from 12 inches to 4 inches. And now there was a difference between the two groups. The group that had received the theoretical explanation quickly adapted to the 4 inches of water, while the group that had not received the theoretical explanation made more errors. So the group that received the theoretical explanation was able to transfer learning during the second stage of the experiment. So this study seemed to show that learning might not transfer under some conditions, and then it might transfer under other conditions. Experimental approaches to investigating learning transfer continued like this throughout the 20th century, and they sometimes got very creative with the experimental designs. Let's take a quick look at a few of these creative designs because they're pretty interesting. For example, in a 1967 study to investigate the impact of the learning environment on transfer, researchers got 32 undergraduate students to participate in an experiment. The students had to learn lists of words, and the researchers wanted to manipulate the learning environment. So the researchers had some of the students study the word lists while sitting upright in a vertical position. And the other students studied the word lists while lying down in a horizontal position. And then the researchers tested the students while the students were either sitting up or lying down. So what do you think happened? The results of this experiment showed that when the learning and the testing environment were the same, the students' scores were significantly higher than when the learning and testing environments were different. In other words, it was better for a student to learn sitting up and then do the test while sitting up, or to learn lying down and then do the test while lying down. It was not so good to learn sitting up and then do the test lying down, or vice versa. A few years later, a study in 1975 took another creative approach to investigating the same issue, the impact of environment on learning transfer. These researchers did an experiment with 18 people from a scuba diving club at a university. The researchers had these divers try to memorize long lists of words. In some cases, the divers tried to memorize the words while sitting on dry land at the edge of a lake. But in other cases, the divers went into the lake, 20 feet underwater, and tried to memorize the words while sitting there on the bottom of the lake. And then the divers were tested to see how many words they could remember. And this testing took place in two situations, on dry land or underwater. And what they found was that divers who did learning and testing in the same environment performed better than divers who did learning and testing in different environments. In other words, it was better for a diver to learn words underwater and then do the test underwater, or to learn words on dry land and then do the test on dry land. It was not so good for a diver to learn underwater and then do the test on dry land, or vice versa. And here's one more really interesting study. This is from a decade and a half later in 1990. This study again was investigating the impact of learning environment on transfer. But this time, instead of being vertical versus horizontal, or being on land versus underwater, this study looked at the influence of odors. In other words, the smell of the learning environment. The participants were 72 undergraduate students who had to go into a laboratory and try to learn a long list of words. While the students were working on this, the researchers pumped odors into the laboratory. For some of the students, the odor was chocolate, and for the other students, the odor was mothballs. Later, the students were tested to see how many of the words they could remember. And during testing, for some of the students, the odor of chocolate was pumped into the room. And for the other students, the odor of mothballs was pumped into the room. And the results showed that the students who did learning and testing in the presence of the same odor performed better than students who did learning and testing in the presence of different odors. In other words, it was best for a student to learn while smelling chocolate and then do the test while smelling chocolate, or to learn while smelling mothballs and then do the test while smelling mothballs. It was not so good for students to learn while smelling chocolate and then do the test while smelling mothballs, or vice versa. Now, we might question how practical some of these studies are. I don't know how common it is for students to study while lying down or while underwater, though they might be studying at home around dinner time when they can smell delicious odors. But in general, what this research is suggesting is that having similar learning and testing situations can help with transfer, and having different learning and testing situations might get in the way. So those are just a few particularly interesting examples of the creative ways that experimental psychologists have investigated learning transfer. I think they have probably had the most fun with some of those interesting research designs, but they aren't the only ones who have investigated transfer. Another area where there has been lots of research on transfer is human resources development. This is the area of research that focuses on workplace training. And as you can imagine, learning transfer has been of great interest because without transfer, the organizations are wasting the massive amounts of money that get spent in this industry every year. So there has been lots of research on learning transfer in this area. And these studies have been done in a wide range of contexts, involving employees in companies and organizations in a wide range of industries, such as energy, pharmaceuticals, telecommunications, transportation, finance, and information technology. And in countries around the world, in Asia, Africa, Europe, Australia, and the Americas. And unlike the experimental designs that we looked at a minute ago, this research has tended to involve survey designs with questionnaires distributed to larger numbers of participants. Let's look at one example, and it's a study done right here in India. In 2016, researchers investigated learning transfer among employees at a power transmission company in Uttar Pradesh. The researchers identified 149 employees who had attended at least 3 training programs in the previous year. And the researchers were interested in whether these employees transferred that learning and whether the transfer was influenced by the nature of the training and by their supervisor's support. The researchers distributed a questionnaire that had 13 items, and these items asked the participants to agree or disagree with statements about whether they had transferred learning, whether the nature of the training helped, and whether their supervisors had been supportive. And the results of the study showed that training design and supervisor support did both predict learning transfer. This is interesting because it builds on the experimental studies we looked at a few minutes ago. Those studies showed the importance of contextual similarity. And this study adds to that the importance of support in a transfer situation. For example, support from supervisors. So we've looked at research on learning transfer in experimental psychology and in human resources development. So now let's take a look at learning transfer that's a little bit closer to home. Research that has investigated transfer in second language education contexts. In a branch of second language education where I've done most of my own research, English for Academic Purposes Education, or EAP, There has been quite a lot of transfer research, especially in the last 20 years or so. This research has involved a variety of research designs, in particular a design that we haven't mentioned yet today, longitudinal qualitative studies. For example, in a recent study done in 2020, researchers investigated transfer from an EAP course for engineering students at a university in Singapore. The participants were 25 undergraduate students, and the researchers gathered data over one academic year through interviews with the students and by examining the students' writing assignments in their engineering courses. The researchers found evidence of transfer in the interviews and in the writing samples, and they concluded that EAP teaching that had a specific disciplinary focus, because in this case the EAP course was engineering specific, they concluded that this focus can promote transfer. I think this is probably another example of contextual similarity, which we saw in the experimental psychology studies earlier. In this case, though, similarity was in disciplinary content. So many of the transfer studies in EAP education have involved this kind of longitudinal qualitative research design, but occasionally other designs have been used as well. For example, a questionnaire survey approach was used in 2015 by a researcher to investigate transfer among students taking EAP courses at a university in Thailand. The questionnaire included items about transfer and about the kind of teaching in the EAP course. And the results suggested that certain kinds of teaching techniques can help to promote transfer. And we've also seen some experimental studies, similar to the psychology studies I described earlier. I'll share this one last example here because it has a particularly interesting result that I think demonstrates the value of teaching for transfer in second language education. This is a study that one of the PhD students I supervised recently completed. And the focus was on EFL teaching rather than English for academic purposes. This was an investigation of transfer in the South Korean English education context. And the researcher was interested in the impact of accents in materials for teaching English listening comprehension. In South Korea, the National University Entrance Examination includes a test of English ability. And this test has listening comprehension questions that include only American English accents. The researcher was concerned that this kind of material might not be preparing students for the real world, where English is spoken by people with a huge variety of accents. So the researcher wanted to see what would happen if students were trained to listen to a wider variety of accents. The participants were 66 students in 4 EFL classes at a secondary school in Seoul, South Korea. 2 of the classes were the experimental group, and the other 2 classes were the control group. The study took about 3 weeks, during which all of the students had a listening comprehension pretest, followed by 7 listening comprehension lessons, followed by 2 post-tests. The general structure of the lessons was the same for all of the students. Each lesson took about 15 minutes, during which the students did several listening comprehension exercises, which involved listening to a recording of someone speaking English and then answering comprehension questions, followed by listening to the recording again while reading a transcript of the recording. The difference between the experimental group and the control group was that for the control group, the exercises were recorded with only American English accents. But for the experimental group, the exercises were recorded with a wider range of English accents. It included Australian, Canadian, Hong Kong, Filipino, Chinese, and Japanese English accents. After these 7 lessons, all of the students did 2 post-tests. The first post-test examined students' listening comprehension with all of those accents from the training, plus 3 new accents that were not included in the training. And those were Thai, British, and Singaporean English accents. And the second post-test examined students' listening comprehension with authentic recordings of real speeches and conversations. So, can you guess what the results showed? On the first post-test, the experimental group performed better than the control group with all of the accents. In other words, the experimental group outperformed the control group on the accents that were in the training materials and on the accents that were not in the training materials, the new accents. So by training with a variety of accents, the experimental group's listening comprehension ability transferred to completely new accents. And on the second post-test, the experimental group performed better than the control group. So the experimental group's listening ability transferred from inauthentic test-like materials to authentic activities. Now, these findings seem very interesting and useful because the teaching intervention was minimally intrusive and the impact was impressive. All the researcher did was take existing teaching and testing materials and re-record them with speakers with a variety of accents. And the students did the training for only a few minutes during just a few regular classes. And this training successfully prepared students to listen to a wide variety of accents, including accents that they hadn't heard before. So this study points to another way that we can try to promote students' learning transfer by making sure that their practice activities have variety. So that's it for the examples of studies that have been used to investigate transfer in second language education and in other areas. So let's step back a little now and take a look at some of the main lessons that we've learned from this research. And here I'll focus again on the area where I've done most of my own work, English for academic purposes education. Although this is just one branch of second language education, I think the lessons that we've learned here can be applied to some degree across second language education contexts. So first, we know in general that EAP learning can transfer. A number of studies have produced evidence that students transfer learning from EAP courses to work in other courses. And this research has been done in a wide range of EAP contexts. For example, colleges and universities in all of these countries listed on the slide here. For example, some studies have examined students' academic records and have shown that students who took a particular EAP course had significantly better grade point averages and graduation rates than students who did not take that course. And this shows that something transferred from the EAP course. The second thing we know is that a variety of kinds of EAP learning can transfer. This includes learning related to reading, writing, listening, speaking, and academic study in general. For example, the ability to manage time, to find sources, to prepare for tests, and to conduct analyses. And third, we know something about the circumstances under which EAP learning transfers. We can see, for example, that when EAP learning transfers, it can have a positive impact on the quality of a student's work. This includes, for instance, transfer that leads to students getting a higher score on a vocabulary or grammar test, or a higher score on a reading or listening comprehension test, or making a smaller number of grammar mistakes in an essay. But an improvement in quality isn't the only kind of impact that transfer can have. And we don't know quite as much about other kinds of impacts. For example, we don't know much about whether transfer has an impact on students' speed when they are doing academic work. For example, how much reading they can do in a given amount of time, or how fluently they can speak. And we don't know much about whether transfer has an impact on students' approach to doing academic work. For example, whether they use certain kinds of strategies, like listening or speaking strategies, when they do academic work. We can also see that when EAP learning transfers, it is sometimes prompted, in the sense that activities provide explicit hints to students about what they should transfer. For example, if students are asked to complete a grammar or vocabulary test that's in a multiple choice format, it's relatively obvious to the students that they are supposed to try to transfer something that they learned previously about grammar or vocabulary. And as a result, this kind of transfer is relatively easy because it is simply a matter of recognizing something that is in a provided list of choices. But we also have plenty of evidence of EAP students transferring learning in a more spontaneous way, in activities that are open-ended and that don't provide explicit hints about what students should transfer. For example, when students are asked to write an essay or to participate in a group discussion, and they are not given any more specific instructions than that, if transfer occurs in these situations, it's relatively spontaneous, because students have had to work out for themselves what learning they can transfer. And this is an important distinction because spontaneous transfer is more difficult than transfer that is prompted. And we can also see that when EAP learning transfers, it can occur across varying distances. What this means is that EAP learning can transfer when the learning situation and the transfer situation are similar. For example, when they occur around the same time, or in the same place, or when they deal with the same kind of subject matter, or when the activities have a similar format. In these cases, when transfer occurs, we can call it near transfer because of these similarities between the situations. But EAP learning can also transfer when there are important differences between the learning situation and the transfer situation. For example, when these situations are separated by several weeks or months, or when these situations involve working with different subject matter, or in different locations with different people, or they involve different kinds of activities. In these cases, when transfer occurs, we can call it far transfer because of these differences between the situations. So we know that EAP learning can transfer across different distances. And this is important because far transfer is typically more difficult than near transfer. But we would still like to learn more about transfer distance and EAP learning, because most of the transfer that we have seen is relatively near. So we don't know much about whether EAP learning transfers to situations that are very far. And besides learning a lot about what transfer looks like, we've also learned a lot about what instructors can actually do to try to promote transfer in second language education. First, we can keep in mind that transfer occurs in two main ways. Well-practiced well-practiced habits being transferred unconsciously because of contextual similarities, and abstract knowledge being transferred deliberately without relying on contextual similarity. And this means we can use different approaches to promote transfer. If we want to promote the first kind of transfer, the well-practiced habits being transferred unconsciously because of contextual similarities, we can do a few things. We can make sure students have lots of chances to practice whatever they're learning so they can develop habits. Also, we can try to make the learning context similar to the contexts where we hope students will be able to transfer learning. For example, if we are teaching an EAP course and we hope students will be able to transfer learning to their courses in the natural sciences, we can try to make the EAP course similar to those other courses. For example, by designing the EAP course to include activities, texts, and assignments about the natural sciences. On the other hand, if we want to promote the second kind of transfer, which is abstract knowledge being transferred deliberately, we can make sure our students engage in abstract thinking and connection making. For example, if we are teaching an EAP course, we might ask students to look at a variety of examples of research papers and try to identify general principles of good research papers, and to think about where they might be able to use these principles. In this way, the students will be thinking abstractly and making connections in a way that can prepare them for transfer outside the EAP classroom. And because this kind of transfer is deliberate, it needs motivation. So we can also look for ways to help our students develop motivation to transfer learning. For example, we can make sure our students are aware that they are learning and that there will be opportunities to use what they learn outside our course. And that if they do transfer learning, it will have a positive impact. For example, helping them to get better grades or to do their work more quickly. We can also discuss with them their beliefs about transfer to help them understand that learning should lead to transfer and that transfer can happen in different ways. And one more step we can take, the third bullet in that gray box on the bottom right, is to help students to prepare for what's called transfer climate, which is the support they may or may not receive when they are in a transfer situation. For example, if we are teaching an EAP course, we expect our students will be able to transfer learning to their other courses. In those courses, students may experience varying degrees of support for transfer. For example, if academic English ability is graded in other courses, this may support transfer because students may interpret this as an indication that academic English ability is valued in the other courses. On the other hand, if English ability is not graded in other courses, this may be unsupportive of transfer because students may interpret this as an indication that academic English ability is not valued in that course. Similarly, our students' classmates in those other courses may be supportive. For example, talking about their positive attitudes towards academic English. Or those classmates might be more neutral or even negative about academic English. In contexts where our students feel little or no support for transfer, it may be more difficult for our students to actually transfer their learning. So it may help if we can prepare them for those kinds of situations. For example, by raising their awareness that support for transfer can vary and discussing what they can do in situations with varying degrees of support. And moving on now to our third and final question, let's take a quick look at how we can build on the work that has been done on learning transfer in second language education. In other words, where can or should we go from here? One direction I would like to see research on learning transfer go is more experimental studies that help us to see how far second language learning can transfer. Here I'm thinking about more studies like the study that my student recently did looking at accents in listening comprehension materials in South Korean English education. That study showed that learning transferred to listening comprehension tasks that involved different accents and that involved more authentic texts. But transfer situations can differ from learning situations along a variety of dimensions. For example, the learning situation might be in a classroom, and the transfer situation might be in a workplace. Or the learning situation might involve academic subject matter, and the transfer situation might involve professional subject matter. And the purpose of the learning situation might be academic, while the purpose of the transfer situation might be recreational. Or the learning situation might be now, and the transfer situation might be months or years from now. If research is very precise about the transfer dimensions that it's investigating, we will be able to build up a very clear picture about steps that we can take to promote transfer and where we can expect transfer to occur. Another direction I would like to see research on learning transfer go is towards the development of tools and procedures that will make it easier for educators and researchers to investigate transfer in second language education. Many of the studies of transfer in EAP education contexts involve time-consuming, complicated designs. For example, tracking students over months or years through interviews and analyses of their work. This can lead to valuable information, but it might also be off-putting for educators and researchers who would like to investigate transfer but don't have the resources for such time-consuming, complicated designs. Transfer research in human resources development, on the other hand, has typically involved questionnaire survey designs that are relatively efficient. Now, those designs do have drawbacks, such as concerns over the validity of self-reported data, but such designs may also be more attractive to educators and researchers with limited resources. And there are some good examples of what this might look like in second language education. One of the studies I referred to earlier, by Green in 2015, was a questionnaire survey of students in EAP courses at a university in Thailand, focusing specifically on the students' perceptions of transfer and of teachers' use of transfer promoting techniques. And another study that I haven't mentioned earlier in this presentation, but that was very interesting and useful, was by Su and Chen in 2014. They developed a practical framework for evaluating ESP courses, and the framework includes a questionnaire survey of students focusing specifically on transfer. Further research that can help to improve these kinds of efficient tools and procedures and make them widely available will be helpful in getting more educators and researchers involved in investigations of learning transfer, and the result will be a richer understanding for all of us. And that's about all I would like to cover today. I know the time is almost up. We've spent the last hour or so going over these three main questions. What is learning transfer, and why is it important in second language teaching? How have we investigated learning transfer, and what lessons have we learned? And where do we go from here? So we've covered a lot of ground, and I hope it's been interesting and useful for everyone. For example, by pointing to ways that we as educators can try to make our teaching even more conducive to transfer. And I'll close with a quote that I think illustrates again some connections between learning transfer and this conference's theme, transdisciplinary learning. In the 1908 study that I referred to earlier, which involved elementary school students throwing darts at targets underwater, the author went on to describe why academic textbooks are not effective at promoting transfer. Most of our textbooks are written with a division and subdivision of the subject and a finished nicety of definition, which destroys all possible links with anything else. Knowledge must, I am clear, be divided into fine particles in order to pass the narrow gateway into the young mind. But I never take up one of these highly dogmatic and completely subdivided textbooks on grammar or arithmetic without a shudder. Our textbooks make boys and girls learn in such a way that there shall be a wall of division between arithmetic and everything else. And not only so, but we make the intelligent child, who would naturally find common characteristics in the various processes which are described within the covers of a single book, afraid to look from one section into the next. I think in that quote from over 100 years ago, the, quote, divisions and subdivisions of the subject are what transdisciplinary learning is trying to address. And with that in mind, education that effectively promotes learning transfer may be a helpful way forward. I've got one more slide here with a list of references that we've talked about today. I hope you found those examples interesting and useful, and there's a lot more where those came from. So if you find this topic interesting and you want to dig more deeply into the research on your own, I think you might have some fun. So thank you again, everybody, for coming today. It's been a real pleasure talking with you, and I'm looking forward to hearing any questions that you might have. I've put my contact information on this slide because if you're concerned about transfer in your own classes, institutions, and organizations, please feel free to reach out to me because I would be really interested to hear about your concerns. I have lots more information about this topic on my website, so please feel free to visit. And if I can answer any questions, just let me know. Thank you again, and I think we have some time for questions. I think I caught most of the question, but can you please tell me again about the specific context that you're interested in? You said a particular kind of approach to teaching accents, to dealing with accents? Yeah. And so it sounds like you're talking about inclusive classrooms, I think is the label that you used. And I'm not sure that I have the same, exactly the same idea of what that is. But we talk, for example, here at Arizona State University, we talk a lot about inclusivity. It's an important part of the charter of our whole university. Diversity and inclusion. This is very important here, and I know it is around in institutions and programs around the world. So I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about what it means here in the institution where I work and the kinds of courses that I'm most familiar with. And I think the research that my student did, I think fits well with let's call it the goal of inclusive teaching, inclusive education, because the starting point for that research was my students' concern about how well the English education program teaching, how well was it preparing students for the real world. And this is in my students' own words, in the real world where English is used with such a wide variety of accents and in such a wide variety of contexts and by such a wide variety of speakers. So yeah, he was drawing, I think, doing a great job of drawing attention to what looks like a gap between the kinds of teaching materials that they were using commonly in that context, materials that had a very limited range of accents. And I think we can apply this beyond accents, but this particular research was focusing on accents. There was a very limited range of accents in those materials, and that was a mismatch from my student's perspective and from my perspective as well. So I agree with my student about that there's a mismatch between those kinds of materials and the real world contexts where those students are going to experience English. They're going to be in situations where they They hear English being spoken by speakers from around the world. First language speakers of English, second language speakers of English, third language speakers of English, a huge range of accents that those students are going to hear. So I think that this kind of focus of the research, I think that fits well with concerns that we might have about inclusive teaching. And again, that's coming from the perspective that I have here in Arizona, what we mean at my institution by inclusive teaching. So I'm not sure that it fits with other ways of looking at that, but that's the way I would see it. Thank you for the question. Yeah. I think so. So if I'm understanding the main parts there about communicative competence or the needs of students who are studying engineering, technology, like this, that's very important to the topic of learning transfer. That's the perspective that I would take. Is I think you're focusing on a very important issue, which is being able to identify students' needs. If we're concerned about teaching for transfer, one of the important steps we can take is trying to, as educators, as much as we can, to try to figure out what the needs are of the students in those target contexts. So, for example, if we're talking about engineering, students studying engineering, technology, finding out what the needs are of those students in their academic studies, in their future professional work. By finding those things out, now we have something that we can try to focus on to promote transfer. But also, hopefully, that's by doing some sort of needs analysis. Hopefully, that's going to give us an understanding of the target context that our students are going to find themselves in. And if you remember, one of the main ways that we can, from my presentation, one of the main ways we can try to promote transfer is to try to make the teaching situation similar in some ways to the target situations that students are going to find themselves in. So by finding out more about what our students are actually going to do outside our class, it can help us to make our class more similar to those situations, hopefully. So I think that's one perspective I would take on this topic. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, and it has been wonderful being with everybody here today. So thank you again for that. Yeah, so I'm very interested in materials, language teaching materials. In fact, one of the courses that I teach here at Arizona State University is a couple of the courses I teach are about curriculum design and materials development. And I'm teaching a group of 25 undergraduate students this semester. Every Thursday night, I have a class with them, and we focus on materials development for language teaching. And one of the topics that we talk about, I try to take a broad perspective in that course. I don't focus only on transfer. I think if it was a graduate level course, I might do a closer focus on transfer. But this is an undergraduate course, so it's a bit broader. But we do talk about, among other things, we talk about the importance of transfer in materials development, right? If we're going to, I feel like it's hard to get away from learning transfer as at least one of the ultimate goals of formal education. If transfer doesn't happen in formal education, some people are going to question the value of the education. And materials are an important part of education. So we need materials that will help to promote transfer. I am not working. I would like to work on textbooks, and I think that's something that's that's been on kind of a back burner for me for a little while because I've been trying to do research on this topic from a variety of angles. But I think that there's definitely a place for materials, including textbooks, that will, let's say, more explicitly deal with transfer concerns. One of the articles that I published a few years ago, I think it was 2018, so about 5 or 6 years ago, was an article about teaching materials and how we can evaluate teaching materials from the perspective of learning transfer. So I tried to put together a kind of a checklist that teachers could use to look at materials that they have available and evaluate those materials from the perspective of transfer. So, look at a textbook and consider, how effective might this textbook be at promoting transfer. So that's about as close as I have come so far, but I think that that's an important question because there is a need for materials that will help with transfer, maybe in more explicit ways. I think it's often assumed. I think that's one of the. I didn't make that point so strongly at the beginning of this presentation, but I think that it's often assumed in education contexts that if students learn, they will transfer learning. But I think that that's perhaps a risky assumption because sometimes it doesn't happen, or often it doesn't happen. So therefore, more attention, more explicit attention might help. Thank you for that question. Well, thank you so much. It really has been a pleasure and an honor for me. I've felt honored to be able to join you. And like I say, I wish I was there in person, and I hope that I can come sometime and hopefully meet some of you in person in the future. So thank you again, and please enjoy the rest of the conference.